Order. Nick Fletcher to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. Christianity in society. The Church and Christianity and the interpretation of the Bible have been in the news more than normal as of late. Recently, the census showed that fewer people identify as Christian. The Church of England has been debating well-known ethical teaching that is now considered controversial in a liberal, modern United Kingdom. Many institutions seem to want to erase any references to their Christian heritage. The London School of Economics recently stated that it will be dropping Easter, Christmas and Michaelmas from their academic calendar. This Easter, the giant bunny will no doubt return once again to my Westminster hotel lobby, but I am sure there will be no sign of a cross. In conversations everywhere, the Lord's name is taken in vain and no one bats an eyelid. The rainbow was long understood to represent God's promise to never again flood the earth. I wonder how many people are even aware of that now. Religious literacy has been declining for decades. Every Christmas and Easter, the newspapers will report some new poll showing that fewer and fewer people understand even the most basic claims of the Christian faith. And the basic historical and legal facts about our Christian heritage and our Christian constitution are receding from our collective cultural understanding. The question is, does it matter? Well, I want to suggest two reasons why it does. Firstly, for constitutional and cultural reasons, and secondly, from a faith point of view. Throughout British history, the Christian Church has pioneered some of the most profound and positive social changes to ever bless these islands. Here, as in many other parts of the world, Christians led the way with universal education and healthcare. As the historian Tom Holland and many others have recognised, so many of the laws and values that we now take for granted have their roots firmly in the Christian faith. It was the biblical idea of God as the ultimate lawgiver that underpinned the Magna Carta, providing the foundation stone of individual freedom and establishing the principle that no one, not even the king, is above the law.
Would the Honourable Member give way? Thank you, Honourable Member. He's making an excellent speech, and I commend him for bringing this subject to the House, especially at this Easter time. He speaks of our Christian heritage. And of course, we stand here in the House of Commons, where, for many of us, William Wilberforce is the most esteemed parliamentarian to have graced these benches. And of course, would he agree with me? It was, of course, his Christian faith which motivated him to battle for years, indeed decades, to challenge the heinous industry of individual slavery and to see the abolition of that trade in his generation.
I thank my honourable friend for her contribution, and I thank you for her support today and her continued support. And it's actually my next sentence I mentioned before, so I will carry on. But thank you. It was the Christian faith that moved John Locke to develop our understanding of religious toleration. It was the Christian faith that compelled William Wilberforce, as my honourable member friend has just mentioned, to fight the slave trade, set up the homes for the elderly, and to establish the RSPCA. It was the Christian faith that moved Lord Shaftesbury to campaign for better working conditions and provisions for the mentally ill. It was Christianity that inspired Hannah More to set up free schools for the poor. Again, it was Christianity that prompted Josiah Wedgwood to revolutionise working conditions in his factories. It was the Christian faith that led Elizabeth Fry to campaign for prison reform. And it was I will do.
Bringing this debate to the House today. And while there's no doubt that it was people motivated by Christian beliefs that achieved all of those social advances, isn't it also the case that it was so-called Christians that put those evils into place in the first place?
Pardon?
It was also people who claimed to be Christians who introduced all of those evils into the United Kingdom society in the first place.
I thank my honourable friend for his contribution, and obviously there's lots of people throughout the entire history who may not have used their faith or may not have used the interpretation of the Bible in the way that I believe, and many Christians today believe, that it should have been done. But the list of the people that I've just read out there have done some wonderful things.
Yeah.
Well, honourable friend, allow me.
I will indeed, yes.
The honourable gentleman is to be commended for bringing this debate forward, and I support everything he says. And of course, this building, the bastion of democracy, is full of Christian iconography, particularly the other end near the House of Lords. Perhaps they're closer to God than we are. But I want to ask him one question. There will be pressure inevitably that we should disestablish the Church of England. Now, I'm not an Anglican, but I think that the fact that we have an established church is a very important symbol of our commitment to Christianity. So would he say a word about the importance of keeping the established church established?
I thank my honourable friend for his contribution, and I will, of course, as the speech goes on, I will make that point. Oh, thank you. Many of our laws are based around the tablets given to Moses on Mount Sinai and the ethical teaching of the Old and New Testaments. The great biblical institution of marriage is recognised by social science for the emotional and material blessing it brings to spouses and their children. The Christian faith is woven into the social and physical fabric of the United Kingdom. The beautiful and symbolic church buildings across this land, with their tall steeples reaching for the heavens, are part of our history and culture, not just our skyline. This place in which we stand today took its name from the noble Abbey Church of St. Peter's, the minster in the west. The bishops play their part in the House of Lords, reflecting hundreds of years of having an established church. Prayers are said every day in chambers of both houses. Above each entrance to central lobby, the patron saints from all four parts of our United Kingdom are celebrated in murals. And the tiled floor contains the words of Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labour in vain.
Yes.
At the coronation, His Majesty the King will be anointed in the name of God as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, as well as Head of State. The St. Edward's crown placed on his head contains a cross and orb symbolising the King and our world under the authority of God. Many people who don't have a personal faith in Christ still value this history and the benefits it has given us. Of course, some want to rewrite history, but everywhere you look, you see our Christian heritage, and no more than in this place.
Yes.
So it matters to our national life. It is the air we breathe. Although many deride and misrepresent it, the reality is it has been a source of great benefit. Much of what makes Britain great stems from this heritage, and many others from around the world recognise this. So why don't we? We should be proud of our Christian history and our Christian values. It would be a constitutional disaster to try and erase it. But even worse, it would be a spiritual disaster. Which brings me on to the main reason we should cherish the Christian faith, because I, as many others, believe it is true. Let me speak of the basics of Christianity. The foundational premise of the gospel is that we are all sinners. We do wrong, wrong against God, wrong against one another, and we know it. I know it. I'm not proud of it, but it is true. I think if we were really all truthful with ourselves, we all would admit we are not the good people we would like to think we are. We might not be all out stealing and assaulting people. However, I'm sure we have all said things we wish we hadn't said, done things we wish we hadn't done. We've been unkind instead of kind, greedy instead of generous. We've broken promises instead of keeping them. We've told lies instead of telling the truth. We've done the things as parents or partners that we know we shouldn't have. In the Old Testament, they covered their sins with sacrifices, their prize lamb or goat sacrificed to God. But God knew we were never going to be able to meet his hopes for our lives. And this is why the events of Easter happened. John 3:16, probably the most famous verse in the Bible, says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." At Christmas, we celebrate Christ's birth. He came into the world as a unique person, one who was fully human, like us, but also divine and therefore perfect and sinless. On Good Friday, we remember the cross where Jesus was sacrificed to cover our sins. And then on Easter Sunday, we celebrate the fact that he rose from the dead to sit at the right-hand side of God, defeating death for the sake of everyone who believes in him. The Christians who have had such a great influence on the life of this nation knew these things to be true because they are written in the pages of the world's best-selling book, the Holy Bible. Those of us who believe in this book may not perfectly understand it. We may even sadly sometimes misuse it. But it is still true and it is still perfect. And with the help of God's Holy Spirit, anyone can understand it. It's not a religion that is only open to clever people. In fact, one of the reasons the Christian faith is sometimes derided and rejected is because it's disproportionately a religion for the kind of people that elites look down on: the poor, the weak, the uneducated. But as the Bible itself says, God uses the weak to shame the strong. The Bible is a book of truth, love, and grace. A book written by God through his chosen people. A book that gives someone like me the promise of eternal life and wise guidance about how to be a better person. I became a Christian in my mid-30s. I knew of Christ many years before, but never thought I was good enough. I was right. I wasn't. The Bible is shockingly plain that we cannot make ourselves good enough for God, no matter how many good deeds we try to do. But that is the beauty of Christianity and the Easter story. Forgiveness is given to us by God, by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And this good news is offered to everyone, everywhere. All our sins, past and present, are forgiven once we make that decision. Let me tell you, it's a wonderful feeling to be forgiven. Blessed and certain of the promise of eternal life. It's wonderful knowing my Maker is with me at all times, right here, right now. With me in my triumphs, there have been a few, but more importantly, with me in the dark times too. I couldn't do this job without my faith. I would have had some lonely walks over Westminster Bridge to my hotel after a long, difficult day without God at my side. Now, I'm not sure how this speech will be received. Some people are very hostile to the idea of Christian politicians. So let me try and reassure you. The two greatest instructions are taught in Luke 10:27. Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength and all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself." And he said, my neighbour is everyone in here, from all parties and everyone out there too. Now that doesn't mean I have to agree with them, thank goodness for that, but it does say that I must love them.
He asks, or he says he's not sure how his speech will be received. I've been just about 13 years in this house, and I have never been more moved listening to a speech. He echoes so much of my own experience. I became a Christian when I was 27, and it changed my life. It gave my life meaning and purpose, and as he says, to know that we are so loved by someone who was willing even to send his son to die on a cross, and would have done so had we been the only person in the world. I'd just like to put on record my appreciation for the honourable member's bravery in speaking so boldly and so clearly about his faith. I believe it echoes the faith of many, many others in this place and across this country, in this place and across this country. It humbles me to consider that perhaps over 13 years I should have been bolder and braver, but I thank him for what he has done and said today.
Thank my honourable friend, and she's one of the boldest people and bravest that I know here, so thank you very much.
Could I intervene again? I just want to echo what my honourable friend has said. It's a very moving and beautifully written speech, which we never hear normally in this place. I just wonder whether he wants to comment. I think a lot of politicians who may have religious belief are very frightened of talking about it because they think they will put themselves on a pedestal, and when inevitably they fail, or if the worst comes to worst, there's some scandal, they are doubly denounced. But I'm not sure that that is a good reason for not talking up about your faith, because the way the Honourable Gentleman is talking about his faith, he admits that he constantly fails, that he's a sinner and all those sort of things. So even if he does fail in the future, that's absolutely no reason why he shouldn't talk about his faith publicly.
Thank my honourable friend. At the beginning of the speech, I've known about Christianity all my life. I was brought up in a Christian home, but I didn't want to make that commitment because I never thought I was good enough. I thought the mistakes I made would be too many, and a Christian person should be this wonderful person that has a halo. As you realise and as you learn about the Bible, you realise that that's not true, and it's because I make mistakes that I became a Christian. I'll go back again. I hope I've not offended anybody. I hope I've given a true account of the need for Christianity as a nation and as individuals. The West as a whole is under threat from many foreign aggressors, and many a commentator is saying the West is under threat from itself. Whether we see Christianity as part of our history or whether we embrace it as our own personal faith, it matters to all of us. Whether or not we are believers, our way of life is built on Christianity, and to let it fall by the wayside, thinking it does not matter, I believe will be a terrible mistake. I thank you for listening today. I hope some of those watching and listening have learned something new about the great history of our nation. But most of all, I hope they have heard the Christian message of faith, hope and love, and that some of them might start on the same wondrous journey as I did with God at their side. I look forward to hearing colleagues' thoughts.
To Bob, for me, the question is that this House has considered Christians in society. Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, and my apologies for my late arrival. My apologies to the member who's moving the motion. I was delayed in the chamber. And I congratulate him on securing a debate on this subject, one that's extremely important and one I think too often neglected. And his efforts to highlight the value to our society of faith, and Christian faith in particular, is to be commended. It can often seem that the Christian faith is in retreat, and certainly recent statistics about church attendance seem to support this. But it's nothing new for the Christian church. What I think is particularly concerning is the lack of knowledge about the Christian faith, and it was in this, in part, that I, along with my honourable friend from Don Valley, recently held a debate in this chamber about religious education. I hope, Mr Mundell, that the House will allow me to reflect on my own upbringing. Being a child of the 1950s, like many, I attended Sunday school, and thinking back to my school days at Wellhome Junior School in Grimsby, in our class, which at that time had about 35 pupils, I would say that around half regularly attended Sunday school, many of them at my church, All Saints in Grimsby, or the neighbouring Methodist church, which at that time had a thriving congregation. At Sunday school, we were, of course, introduced to the basic tenets of the faith. Importantly, this continued with daily assemblies at school, and I still recall some of the prayers used by my head teacher at Wellhome and later at Havelock School in Grimsby. Sadly, these days, too many schools neglect the religious aspect of education. Of course, the approach taken by schools, and indeed by our churches, has had to evolve, but I wonder how many head teachers take the approach that the head at my daughter's school. I recall attending a parents' evening in what would be the mid-1990s. When questioned about religious education, he said that he regarded the school's role not to indoctrinate children, but to bring them to the threshold of faith, if only that were the case today. Without knowledge of the Christian faith, a faith whose teachings form the basics of our laws and so many other foundations of our society, it's not possible to appreciate our history, our culture, and so much more. It's part of the glue that holds our society together. So many of our schools have their roots in the churches who have established schools and charitable institutions. Now, I'm a worshipping member of the Church of England, and like many in its congregation up and down the country, I'm often frustrated and feel that it's lost its way. Of course, it should be doing good works, and as I mentioned a minute or two ago, supporting schools and the like. But I sometimes think it's neglecting what surely must be its core job, that of spreading the gospel. It needs to kick into touch the endless and tortuous debates about sexuality and commenting on the minutiae of government policy, and start getting people into its churches to hear a clear Christian message. I certainly will.
I agree that the core message of the church has to be sharing the gospel of Christ and the good news that we've heard today. But does he agree that many, many Christians across the country today are very worried about sharing their faith, even about publicly quoting from the Bible, because they're worried about what the law says? In fact, actually, by law, religion or belief is a protected characteristic acknowledged by the Equality Act in 2010. It shouldn't be given any less respect to an expression of faith than any other protected characteristics. There isn't a hierarchy, but often, would the member agree, that's often how Christians feel. They're not asking, however, for any special privilege when they express their faith, just asking not to be at a disadvantage when they express their views and their beliefs compared to other groups in society.
I thank my honourable friend for the intervention and entirely agree. There is a reluctance amongst the public to be open about their faith because they do genuinely fear potential repercussions. And I'm coming on in a moment to
friend allow me before he goes on to another subject. Yep. Because he was talking about the way that the church leaders speak up. I remember once we asked for a meeting of the MPs with the Bishop of Lincoln, and on a long list of subjects he wanted to talk to us, the top was the widening of the A15. And I just wonder whether our church leaders, whether it's the Catholics or bishops, should actually concentrate more on talking about spirituality. Although Christians might be in a minority, people of faith in this country are still in a very big majority. That's including Muslims, Hindus, many others. So will he share my concern that we want to hear more from our bishops about the deep value and well of spirituality, in addition to all the good causes they talk about, which are perfectly valuable in themselves?
I thank my right honourable friend for his intervention and entirely agree. And in years gone by when I was acting as his constituency agent, I can recall many of those meetings. It would have been rather nice had they concentrated on spiritual matters. Having said that, I do believe that the Church of England does, on the whole, speak for the decent, silent majority who recognise that the church plays an important part in society. And though they may not attend church regularly, like to think that it's there. I'm reading a book at the moment called God in Number 10. Other members may have obtained a copy when it was launched here in the House a few months ago. Its author is Mark Vickers, but I emphasise that he is, to the best of my knowledge, no relation. Indeed, yes. In the section on Stanley Baldwin, I was struck by a reference the former Prime Minister made. He reportedly said to King George VI that the average working man, and I'm sure he'd say woman as well in that if he were alive today, might not go to church, him or herself, but that he was glad to know that his monarch did. Can I suggest to colleagues that the average working men and women probably think the same about their Member of Parliament? We shouldn't be afraid to do God, as Alistair Campbell didn't say. I certainly get more criticism for being a Conservative than for being a Christian. Incidentally, in another extract from that book, it refers to a comment by Charles Gore, who was Bishop of Oxford between 1911 and 1919. And apparently he said in a letter to the Times that he doubted the cohesion of the Church of England was ever more seriously threatened than it is now. Well, he could have said that yesterday, but rather than a century ago. Mr Mundell, we in this country are blessed in that we can, despite the thoughts of some of the keyboard warriors and others, with few exceptions, practice our faith in safety. As we know, that is not the case in many parts of the world. And I praise my honourable friend, the member for Congleton, who, in her role as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief. First, it should be welcome that the Prime Minister and indeed his predecessor have made such an appointment, and also to commend the work of the Honourable Member for Strangford for all the work that he does in relation with the work of this all-party group. Mr Mundell, faith plays an important part in the life of billions of people across the globe, and we must do all we can to ensure that they can practice their faith in safety. Here in the UK, Mr Mundell, I sincerely hope that the Christian faith lasts for very many more centuries to come.
Matt Rhoda.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve on your chairmanship. And may I also thank the member for bringing forward this debate, and indeed thank Mr Mundell again for fitting me in at the last moment. Today's debate is timely given the approach of Easter. It's also we're now in the holy month of Ramadan, and Passover and Baisakhi will soon be upon us as well. I should declare an interest as somebody who's brought up as Church of England, although I have to say I was told off by a local vicar last year for not attending regularly. He has a very good memory because I think the last time I went was some years ago. But I do want to pay tribute to the role of churches in my community, and I think it's also timely to reflect on the wider values of faith communities in British history as well. Certainly in Reading and in Woodley, the other town which I represent, there's an enormous contribution from our local faith community, churches, indeed many other faiths as well. And I just wanted to thank them for their outstanding community work at this time, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that. I wanted to give the example of one particular community organisation which has benefited enormously, and that's the Whitley Community Development Association. This is a group led by residents in a very disadvantaged part of our community, where they regularly receive donations of food and other support from local churches. Indeed, from other faith communities, they've had support from a Gurdwara from as far away as Slough, which certainly from a Reading perspective is some way away, maybe perhaps not for people outside Berkshire. And I would like to thank all of those churches and other faith communities for getting involved. Other food bank support in our area includes the Trussell Trust, Ready Food, which is heavily involved with local churches. And I would like to thank them as many families and pensioners are suffering enormously in the cost of living crisis, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them. Other notable community organisations which have a religious link include Communicare, which carries out very useful advice work to many residents, and I have to say it's been a privilege to visit its office on a number of occasions, and there are literally queues of people waiting outside in the morning to see this charity and to be helped. And I would once again like to thank local church members for their support for that, and indeed other faith communities and people of no faith for their work in community organisations. If I may, Mr Mundell, I would also like to pay tribute, and I think this is a practical demonstration of people's faith, which is truly humbling. In our town, as in many parts of the country, there's a terrific problem with homelessness, and I have been privileged to visit New Beginnings, which is a wonderful community organisation which takes in people who are street homeless and offers them a warm meal and a place to stay. They've converted a former pub and turned it into a place of refuge for people who are in deep trouble, and they're offering very practical help, and that was set up by a number of practicing Christians, and there's a very strong church element to that. I may also, if I may, mention Sadaka, which is a similar organisation but has Muslim heritage, and equally a number of practicing Muslims wanted to show their support to the wider community, and in a truly amazing demonstration of that support, they offer food regularly on a Saturday morning. They have no property of their own, and they're looking for one. So if anybody has a spare property in Reading they could give them, we'd be delighted to accept that. And I appreciate time is limited, but if I may just mention two other forms of help which I think are very well worth mentioning as a form of practical demonstration of people's faith, both in my area but across the country, and those are wider help for the vulnerable, and I would like to mention street pastors in particular, but also the long-standing work of church and faith communities in supporting international development. I particularly wanted to thank CAFOD. I'm not a Catholic myself, but I'm hugely supportive of their work. They've reached out to me since I became an MP in 2017. But there are many other groups, including the other charities that make up DEC nationally, which include Oxfam, Muslim Relief, and a number of others who do incredible work. And that is motivated by people's faith and belief in supporting other human beings at a time of great need. And I think that those charities deserve huge support and appreciation for the incredibly valuable work that they do. I would also say, though, that there are many other groups who I've not been able to mention, and I do appreciate the opportunity today to just say some words of thanks and encouragement to faith communities, particularly Christians, obviously because of the theme of the debate, who are playing such an important role across so many fields. If I may just finish by saying that I would also like to thank Support You, which is a charity which supports LGBT people in our area, and I've had the privilege of working with them as well, and I think they're an absolutely fantastic organisation. And if I may just finish, thank you, Mr Mundell, for allowing me to take part in today's debate, and I would also like to again thank the member for Doncaster for securing today's debate. It's been a wonderful opportunity to thank many, many hard-working and motivated people whose faith is at the heart of what they do.
I call Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a real pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon, and I'm pleased to begin today's summing up. It won't be the usual sort of political-based summing up that we often see in Westminster Hall debates, because clearly this has not been the usual type of debate. There's been a significant degree of consensus. I want to present a slightly different view. I say this as a lifelong committed Christian who shares many of the values that have been expressed here today. But I think we do need to be careful about how we talk about both the history and the future of Christianity, whether it's within our own nations or elsewhere, because as indicated in my intervention earlier on, while there is no doubt whatsoever that people motivated by Christianity have been responsible for extraordinary acts of kindness, of courage, of bravery, of selflessness from the days of Christ himself, we can't hide from the fact that people who claim to be acting in accordance with Christian teaching have been responsible for some of the most heinous acts ever committed on God's earth. Slavery was set up by people who claimed that it was God's will. Apartheid was set up and maintained by people who claimed that it was God's will. We've seen acts of cruelty and barbarity during wars and crusades throughout the Christian era on earth that were carried out by so-called Christians, but which I find impossible to reconcile with any of the teachings of Jesus, or indeed anything else among the teachings of the church. I had the good fortune to spend 5 years on the Court of Governors of St Andrews University, and on the day they had their annual chapel service in memory of their founders and current benefactors. As soon as that was done, we went outside, and just outside St Salvator's Chapel in St Andrews, there's the initials PH actually built into the pavement, and we would have a memorial service there. Patrick Hamilton was a devout Christian, and the stones mark the spot where this devout Christian was slowly roasted alive by another group of devout Christians because he was devoutly the wrong kind of Christian. And later on in the history of St Andrews, the tables were turned, and the other form of devout Christians were stabbed to death and thrown out the windows of the castle of St Andrews. Tales of such barbarity between Christians, again, have been going on for almost as long as Christianity has existed. So I don't say that to suggest that Christianity has been an evil influence in the world, which some people would suggest. But when we're talking about all the good that has been brought, we also have to be willing to recognise that it has not all been a one-sided story. We also have to recognise that for many people across the world, they still find it difficult to break the bond between Christianity and whether it's slavery, colonisation, persecution, empire building, the exploitation of other lands and their people. Again, the people responsible for those crimes weren't acting in a Christian way, but there is still an association in the minds of a lot of our brothers and sisters across the world that they see Christianity as being associated with the darker side of their history. I don't actually accept the concept of anywhere being a Christian country. It is a matter of fact that for most of our certainly most of our recent recorded history, all of our countries have been led by people who purported to be Christians, but that's not the same thing as being a Christian country. And I do need to point out to the Honourable Member, while he is rightfully proud of a lot of the history and heritage that he referred to, a lot of it is not the heritage of all of us that attend in this place. It's the heritage of one part of one, or certainly of one nation in the United Kingdom. Magna Carta, for example, is an exclusively English document. And I don't think we should mention Magna Carta without recognising that by today's standards, anyone who published it would be arrested, because it was one of the most anti-Semitic documents that has ever been produced. It was very much of its day. But while we might celebrate the liberties that it gave to some people, we also have to recognise that if you were Jewish in England at that time, Magna Carta was not going to liberate you from anywhere. And the same would go, incidentally, for the claim of right of Scotland, because by today's standards, that is an extraordinarily anti-Catholic document. So much of the heritage it spoke about, indeed it is a rich heritage, a heritage that anyone is entitled to be proud of. It's also not the heritage of this Parliament. It might be the heritage of many of the buildings in which this Parliament sits, but it's a heritage of one of its predecessor parliaments. It's a heritage of the English Parliament, which with the Scottish Parliament is combined by the union of the parliaments. In fact, technically, the United Kingdom Parliament has only been going since the early 1800s. So while we can talk about the heritage of the building, don't make the mistake of thinking that the institution that now uses this building necessarily inherits all of that heritage. Just for one example, the Honourable Member behind him mentioned the religious iconography that you see in many places around here, and that's absolutely correct. But the legacy of John Knox in my country was to destroy hundreds of years' worth of religious iconography. So when we're talking about Christian heritage as it's applied in this place, if this place had been in Scotland, a lot of the treasured iconography would have been destroyed. And again, it would have been Christian iconography being destroyed by people who said that it was a Christian thing to do. I would certainly agree with one of I think the most poignant parts of the Honourable Member's speech when he said, I couldn't do this job without my faith. And that is one thing in which I can wholeheartedly agree. I couldn't do anything that I've done in my life without my faith. And I think anybody of genuine belief in any of the faith traditions would say that. I also want to put on record that in almost 31 years as an elected politician, I've never felt under any pressure from anybody to speak or to vote in a way that went against my Christian conscience. I know some of my colleagues have found it very, very difficult, but I've never found it difficult to separate what my faith tells me I should do in the way I run my life, and thinking that it then gives me the right to legislate over how other people run their lives. So when there's talk, for example, I remember the difficulties some of my family and friends had when I supported the scrapping of Section 28 many years ago, because the Catholic Church at that point was against scrapping Section 28, and I took the view the Catholic Church tells me, and I try to follow the teaching about how I practice my own sexuality, but it doesn't give me a right to legislate as to how anyone else practices theirs, any more than it would give me the right to legislate to say you have to go to Mass on a Sunday and you're not allowed to eat meat on Good Friday or Ash Wednesday. In fact, I find that my Christian beliefs attract not nearly as much animosity in social media as some people's do, but any abuse I get on account of my faith on social media tends to come from other people who claim to be Christians. I don't think I've ever had any kind of religious-based abuse from anybody who didn't make it clear that they claimed to be a Christian of some kind. The honourable members have spoken about, for example, the decline in respect for not only for Christianity generally, but the decline in recognition of the great feasts. And it's something that saddens me that most Christians don't realise that we're coming up now to the most important day of the year. Easter in the Christian tradition is significantly more important than Christmas. You wouldn't think it to look at the way that it's celebrated or not. But the decline in respect for Easter, and indeed for the true spirit of Christmas, started long, long before there was any noticeable number of people in these islands that professed other faiths. And it probably started in days when 80 to 90% of the population would have described themselves as being Christians. So essentially, although it's too deep a subject maybe to go into just now, the decline in Christianity that we're seeing in the United Kingdom has been caused by Christians giving up or losing interest or just stopping being particularly concerned about it. It hasn't been caused by outside influences. It's a problem that's been created here within our own Christian faiths, and it's something that can only be addressed from within our Christian faiths. I can't speak for people of other faiths, that there was some discussion during the debate that perhaps church leaders should focus on the spiritual and religious message and not be talking so much about other things. I can't speak for other faiths, but as a Catholic living in Scotland, I certainly haven't noticed a shortage of statements from the leaders of the Catholic Church in Scotland in which they extol the essential spirituality of our faith, or in which they continue to remind us about what Easter is really about and what Christmas is really about, and what a number of other days are really about, for example. And I have to wonder whether people who get uncomfortable when church leaders comment on social matters are really uncomfortable about the fact that their church leaders are telling them that what they're doing, the way they're acting, is not actually in keeping with the teaching of their faith. Certainly when I look at the principles of Catholic social teaching, it's one of the things that drives me in this place, because I find it difficult. I can only assume, and I wouldn't sort of challenge people's sincerity for a minute, I can only assume that those who promote some of the things I see in this place feel that they can reconcile it to Christian social teaching and to Catholic social teaching. But I'm sorry, I find it very difficult to make that reconciliation. Perhaps what we need to do is to recognise that the way in which people promote the Christianity can draw people into the church, or it can push people away. And if people speak Christianity in one way and act in a different way, then it's always going to give us a problem. I have never found a passage anywhere in any part of the Bible where the words appear, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, unless they came here in a small boat."
Thank you, Mr. Mundell, and it's a pleasure to see you in the chair today. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Don Valley in his efforts for securing the debate today. As Shadow Minister for Local Government and Faith, it is my joy and privilege to praise and talk up the vital, meaningful work of countless religious groups that we have across the UK. And as has already been mentioned, especially during this time of year, a special holy time for many religions, with Easter upon us. And last night I joined the APPG for British Muslims as they broke fast in the Speaker's house. Next week, I look forward to hearing more and seeing Jewish traditions around the marking of Passover in the UK and across the world. And in my constituency of Luton North, the interfaith community has been long established, a source of cohesion and strength. Actually, the Luton Council of Faiths received an award from the late Queen for their work and their important, vital work in faith, but importantly, community cohesion as well. And I mention this interfaith work because everybody has talked about their backgrounds. And I grew up in not just a mixed ethnicity, race, heritage household, I grew up in a mixed faith household, both Buddhist and Christian. And so when I see scenes like we saw last night at Manchester Cathedral, where over 1,000 people of all faiths and none were breaking fast and coming together and welcoming each other into the cathedral in much the way the member from Cleethorpes had talked about, opening the doors, it is to be welcomed and to be celebrated. And as we approach Holy Week, when Christians across the world and the UK will be reflecting on both sombre and celebratory nature of the Easter story, I think it's right that we reflect too on their value in our society. They are moral guides, whether it's bishops leading on pressing ethical issues in the House of Lords or being peacekeepers in struggling communities. Particular examples come to mind of the former Bishop of Kensington providing comfort to the traumatised survivors and relatives following the Grenfell tragedy, and leadership in challenging the injustices and some of the continued injustices that have been exposed. Or of the retired Bishop of Liverpool, who did not leave the side of those affected by the Hillsborough disaster throughout endless letdowns, setbacks and injustices. Or of Pastor Mick, who has used his life experiences of violence and addiction to set up the Church of the Street and serve vulnerable people in Burnley. And beneath those that make the headlines, we all know there are so many more Christians working quietly and thanklessly on the ground in all of our constituencies, supporting those who have fallen through the gaps of poverty and misfortune. Their generosity, their compassion became most evident during the pandemic, when alongside all people of faith and none, we saw people relying on churches, mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, mandirs and temples to get the message of public health, public safety out, and to keep their communities fed and meet a variety of other needs. Of course.
I'm grateful to her for giving way. She's giving a very powerful speech, but would you agree that the circumstances she's describing, where people of a variety of faiths and people of no particular faith have all come together for the common good, are a reminder that although many of us in here would hold fast to what we regard as Christian values, those values are not exclusively Christian. And maybe if we recognise that a lot of these values are shared worldwide across people of many different faiths, maybe we'd go on better than we do just now.
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and it is always important to note where we do share values, and those are to our strengths, always. And my honourable friend so powerfully put the points across from Reading West about the vital support that churches and charities provide. And I think on that non-judgmental basis of providing it not just to Christians, but to their wider communities as well, and to everybody that would need that support. Churches and Christian organisations have been stepping forward where the state has stepped back on a large scale for over a decade now. And I see examples of that in my own constituency. St Luke's in Leagrave, when we had fires in tower blocks, they're providing warm banks, despite the fact their bills are going through the roof. Christchurch Busmead, centre of our community, providing support for those in need. We all know about the food banks in our constituencies that run out of churches and are run by Christian charities. And as food prices climb, energy costs soar and wages fall, we can't expect the need for food banks to diminish anytime soon. Then there are also the night shelters. Less so typical at this time of year, but every winter Christian organisations go above and beyond to provide warmth and shelter for homeless people. They do this not because they have an abundance of money, space or resources, but because their faith compels them to do what they can and give what they can. And I note throughout this debate, other honourable members have mentioned books and recommended books, and I would love to take the opportunity to recommend a book from my dear friend and the Chief Executive of the Christian charity Jubilee Plus, Natalie Williams, and it is on the myth of the undeserving poor. Please, over Easter recess, we could add that to our reading list. Vital support, such as the debt services provided by organisations like Christians Against Poverty, have been long-standing, but have never been so needed as they have been now. CAP partners with churches around the UK of all denominations to offer personal budgeting courses, employment support, and breaking free from the paralysing chains of debt. And I will never forget the personal testimony that I heard from CAP when they came to Parliament and to speak to parliamentarians about their work and the vital work that they do. This is just a brief selection of Christian charities working domestically. Globally, there are organisations fighting bravely for religious freedoms, human rights, and tackling poverty and famine. Colleagues here will be aware of the fearless work of Open Doors, working in some of the most dangerous regions of the world to serve persecuted Christians. Over Easter, we must keep in mind the worshippers and believers in places like North Korea, Nigeria, China, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and many, many more, unfortunately, who will risk their lives to worship God this Easter. I also want to pay tribute to International Justice Mission, who work on an international scale to end modern slavery, Tear Fund, who have been providing disaster relief for over 50 years, and Christian Aid, who continue to lead progressive and powerful campaigns on the climate emergency. And these organisations, though, however needed and however important their campaigns are, they are struggling. The cost of living crisis has meant that while demand is higher than ever for food, shelter and financial support, the public's capacity to donate has declined. Wages falling far beneath inflation is forcing ordinary working people to cut back where they can, and for many that will mean reducing or ending charitable giving. This is where we need government action. I would ask the Minister today to go back to her team and other government departments and look at what more can be done to protect our churches and charities from further financial struggle. Stronger interventions on energy costs and business rates would be a very good place to start. And I would like to invite the Minister to consider, after 13 years of government, where she thinks our country would be without the safety net provided by Christians and other faith groups. If families, children, those out of work or struggling with addiction had only the government to rely on, what state would our economic and social health be in? And to ask herself honestly, has the government allowed themselves to become complacent in presuming that faith groups will always be able to step forward and make up for state neglect and failures? And on the contribution of Christians in fighting global issues of injustice internationally, will she update us on efforts to return the level of overseas aid to 0.7%? This Easter, I will be celebrating the inspiring Christians around me in Luton North, the church leaders, their congregations and communities across the UK, and the charities working here and abroad to serve humanity. We can all be inspired and grateful for the hugely powerful impact Christians have in our society. But we must never be, what we must never be, is ignorant of their needs from government and overconfident that they will always be able to clean up our mistakes.
Thank you, and I now call Minister Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Don Valley for firstly securing this debate on Christianity in society and for his very personal and passionate speech. The Honourable Member is a committed champion for his area and a committed advocate of the role of Christianity in our communities. Thank you. I would also like to thank the Honourable and Right Honourable Members from Cleethorpes, Congleton, Gainsborough and Reading East for their very thoughtful and reflective contributions. And I would also like to thank the front bench spokesmen for their profound reflections. To begin with, let me emphasise the importance of the Church as an essential pillar of society. It has been and will always be a bedrock of support for Christians, and it will always be an important institution in Britain. Our country has been built on Christian values, and the Church of England, along with the Church of Scotland, are the two established churches in the UK. As we break for Easter recess, it's important to remember and celebrate the role of the Christian Church in our history, our culture, and our values. It not only plays an important constitutional role in our national life, but it has been instrumental in fostering our values as a society, values of compassion, of tolerance, of respect, as my honourable friend alluded to, love thy neighbour. At Easter time, we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The resurrection signifies the promise of redemption and rebirth and the forgiveness of sin. In my constituency of Kensington, I have the great privilege of having a very, very active Christian community. I have some of the major iconic churches in London, the Brompton Oratory, Holy Trinity, Brompton, St Columba's, Church of Scotland, St Mary's Abbot, the Notting Hill Methodist Church, the United Reformed Church, and I am very proud to have that vibrant community. Faith in general is a vital part of people's identities and of their communities. The government fully supports the invaluable work being done by people around the country who are inspired by their faith. Values like democracy, respect for others, and regard for the rule of law are supported by the overwhelming majority of people in this country. They have evolved over time to become an integral part of life in Britain today. And faith can guide the moral outlook of many, inspiring great numbers of people to public service and to help those in greatest need. Christian values, like values found in other great faiths, are those of humanity and servitude to others. The Church of England, as has been alluded to, holds a unique place in our society. As senior members of the established Church of England, 26 bishops sit as individual Lords Spiritual and are impartial members of the House of Lords. The monarchy also plays an important constitutional and religious role in the UK, with the sovereign acting as head of state and supreme governor of the Church of England. As we approach the coronation of His Majesty King Charles III, there are a number of statutes which govern the declarations and oaths which must be made by a new monarch. The oaths represent an important part of our history and traditions, symbolising the role and duties of the sovereign. Bishops provide an important independent voice and spiritual insight into the work of the upper house, and while they make no claims to direct representation, they seek to be a voice for people of all faiths. Yes.
Fiona Bruce.
Thank her for her speech, and she's spoken about the monarch publicly declaring his faith on oath. Could I ask the Minister if perhaps the government could give some clear guidance as to the rights and freedoms of others in our society, Christians and those of other faiths, to publicly express their faith? Because that right does exist, but there is an enormous amount of confusion about it, and indeed, in some cases, even fear. But the right, of course, does clearly exist, subject to some limited caveats, such as not inciting violence. And could we perhaps also see a review of the guidelines that the police are working to when they arrest or charge people on the grounds, for example, of an alleged hate crime? Because, again, there's a lot of confusion there. Often cases we hear of seem to progress and then there's clearly no case to answer. And finally, can we make it absolutely clear that no one should be arrested simply for silently praying?
Let me address the first question. No one should be in fear of professing their faith, regardless of which faith they belong to, and I think that is very important. In terms of guidance to the police, I'm afraid that does fall outside my jurisdiction. That is a matter for the Home Office, so I will defer on that point, but I do feel very strongly that everyone should be able to declare their faith.
If I may, perhaps the Honourable Lady would pass that request on, because it is a very real one, particularly following the recent passing of the clause in the Public Order Act regarding buffer zones.
I'm very happy to pass on your comments. The latest census does tell us that the number of Christians living in this country has decreased. However, Christianity remains the most prominent religion. Christianity has shaped this country's history, and we should recognise and celebrate that. Our Christian heritage and values are something that we can all be proud of. Both the Honourable Member from Conglington and Don Valley mentioned William Wilberforce. It was his Christian faith which led to the abolition of slavery. It was his resolute Christian faith that prompted him to become interested in social reform, including the improvement of factory conditions in Britain. He firmly believed that the revitalization of the church and individual Christian observance would lead to a harmonious moral society. In every city, town and village in the UK, we see the positive impact and vital contributions that Christianity, Christians and churches make to our society, indeed also as other faiths do too. The Honourable Member for Cleethorpes mentioned the importance of Christian schools and faith schools, and actually just before coming here to the chamber, I was with one of the schools in my constituency, the All Saints Catholic College of North Kensington, which I'm delighted to say is an outstanding school. There is no question that Christian schools play an important role. Churches are often centres of community support, providing a range of services, including after-school care, youth clubs, financial advice, and addiction support, to name but a few. They often provide a safety net for those in need, running, for instance, homeless shelters, food banks, or warm hubs. And as the Minister for Homelessness, I would like to put on record my personal thanks for everything that churches do in support of the homeless. We have recently distributed a 10 million night shelter transformation fund, specifically with a focus on voluntary and faith groups. The Honourable Lady asked what government is doing to support charities. I am delighted to say in the budget that there was 100 million specifically to support charities, and homeless charities and domestic abuse charities will be beneficiaries. We are very conscious of the fact that clearly there are inflationary pressures in the economy, and charities do need more support. So I was delighted that the Chancellor made 100 million available. And clearly this comes on top of the huge amount of support that this government has given to those facing cost of living pressures. In the autumn statement, in the last budget, it was 37 billion. In the autumn statement, it was a further 26 billion. At the moment, we are in effect paying half of everyone's energy bills. The average household is receiving £1,500 per in support on their energy bills. So I just want to make that point. The pastoral impact of the church extends further into our society with the provision of chaplaincy across the public sector, including prisons, hospitals, and the armed forces. As a government, we recognise and support the importance of faith. My colleague, the Minister for Faith and Belief, Baroness Scott, in the House of Lords, continues to champion the brilliant work carried out by our faith communities up and down the country. She meets regularly with leaders from across faith groups in our country. And we were the first government to commission a wide-ranging review into how government engages with faith. As you may be aware, the independent faith engagement advisor, Colin Bloom, will soon be publishing his review. He will be making recommendations to the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities about how government can celebrate the contribution of faith groups and the positive role they have in society, while also tackling practices that are harmful. The public call for evidence for the review received an unprecedented number of responses, 21,000, demonstrating the high level of interest in religion and faith across our society. We will be carefully considering his recommendations when the report is published. In conclusion, I would like to express my gratitude. Yes.
For giving way, and I'm grateful for the Minister's considered response. But in her summing up, I wondered whether she would be happy to answer my question around the 0.7% update on overseas aid.
Let me just address that before I sum up. Again, that falls outside my remit. That is a Foreign Office matter, but I will certainly pass her question on. In conclusion, I would like to express my gratitude to the Christian Church for everything it has done for the people of this country. The government's support for the Christian Church is a reflection of the importance of religion in the UK. Religion plays a significant role in the lives of many people, and the government is committed to ensuring that it can continue to play a positive role in society. By working together, I know we can achieve even more to help our faith communities. Before I conclude my response, I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate an important message that this government is fully behind the work of our faith communities. Easter is the very foundation of the Christian faith. For Christians worldwide, the importance of Easter is praising and acknowledging Jesus Christ's resurrection and what that means to them. Easter is also a time we can all learn from Christians coming together, and a time we can all share with loved ones in unison. I wish my honourable friend and everyone who has taken part in this very timely debate a very happy Easter.
And I now call Nick Fletcher to wind the debate up.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell. I'd like to thank all members for attending today. I understand it is Thursday before recess, so it is. I'm very, very pleased to see so many people here. I particularly like to thank the member for Reading East, who named all the Christian charities that are helping within his constituency, and also the member from Congleton for continued support and for sharing her story of faith. In Parliament, we have the Christians in Parliament, APPG, and they're a fantastic APPG, one of the most active in this place, and I thank them for all their work. I have a Bible study on a Wednesday morning, and everyone is welcome. Please do contact me, but it's so wonderful to be part of that group. And when I first came here as a Member of Parliament, I literally knew nobody. And it was the Christian APPG that helped me through that period. It was a fantastic group for me to get to know. I'd like to thank the Minister for her reply, and I know that she will report back to government on how important this subject is and how well attended it's been, and that she will obviously make sure that Christians are thought of when anything happens within government, because I think it's really important that we think of people of faith. Also, I'd like to thank the Backbench Committee for letting me have this debate. It's really appreciated. And I would like to, as I say, thank the Chair for letting me have this debate today as well. I just want to finish by saying Easter is, more than anything else, is a time to reflect. But it's also, I mean, the main point of Easter was Christ died for our sins, and He forgave us, which is something that we should all remember. And we should follow Christ's lead with that. So no matter how we've been wronged, no matter how far in the past, whether we've been wronged centuries ago, whether we've been wronged weeks ago, whether we've been wronged today, or whether we're wronged in the future, the message of this story, more than anything else, is for forgiveness. And we should all learn. I understand how difficult it is, but if we can all learn to forgive each other, we will have a wonderful future. Happy Easter, everybody.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered Christians in society. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.